Hi. In the previous video, we looked at formatting our docstrings for use with documentation tools. In this video, we're going to look at how to make examples in the documentation testable so that the documentation is never out of date. It's common to include examples of use in our docstrings, but if we're not careful, those examples can get left behind when the code changes, and wrong documentation is worse than no documentation. Fortunately, we have a tool that could check whether the documentation agrees with the code by running the examples from our documentation and seeing what happens. That tool is called doctest. To enable doctest to recognize our examples as things it could test, all we have to do is include the Python interactive shell prompt into our example. In the simplest and most common case, that just means putting a triple greater than symbol in front of each statement. For multi-line statements, we prefix the continuation line with a triple dot symbol. After each statement, we should write down the expected result of the statement, written the same way the interactive shell would write it. In other words, if we copy and paste directly from the interactive shell, we've created an example that doctest can recognize. So, writing doctest is pretty straightforward. There's a decent chance of writing a doctest into our docstrings even if we didn't know the doctest tool exists. As an added bonus, Sphinx recognizes doctests and formats them appropriately too. So, if we're going to include code examples in our docstrings, this is the way to do it. It's easy to have doctest run all the examples in a file and report back whether they worked. We just run the doctest utility from the command line and tell it which file we're interested in. The -v option makes it print out extra information, which isn't necessary, but often is helpful. All we see in this example is lack of error messages rather than any confirmation that everything worked or is tested. There are other ways of running doctest, including a Sphinx plugin that Sphinx Quick Start asks us whether we want. It's also possible to integrate doctests into a test suite. For Python's standard unit test library, or to use an integrated test runner called nose to find and execute them. Doctest directly will do, for our purposes here though. Now what happens if a doctest fails, but after looking at it, we see that the documentation and example are actually correct? Well, that means our code is incorrect. Believe it or not, this is a very good thing. I don't mean that having an error is a good thing, but that error was there, whether we found it or not. Finding it and having a test on hand that will let us check whether we've succeeded in fixing it though, that's good. So, doctest ties our code and documentation together so that they stay synchronized and serve to double check each other. That's a very useful docstring trick. In this video, we learned about writing examples into our documentation and how to use the doctest tool to check whether the examples in code are synchronized. In the earlier videos of this section, we learned about writing readable code, version control to keep track of our code, and virtual environments to keep our development projects isolated. In the next section, we'll get to learn how to turn a package into a program that can be run from the command line.